All right, well, welcome again, everyone. And today's session is about preparing teachers to implement culturally responsive social emotional learning and positive behavioral interventions and supports. This is the first event of the Chris Walsh Center for Educators and Families of Metro West here in the College of Education at Framingham State University. So please stay tuned for some information about the center that you'll be seeing coming out of the Framingham State website soon, and some events for the spring. So I'd like to thank the committee that has been working for several years to plan this center, and thank the College of Education, the Education Technology Office here, as well as my students who I'm sitting in the room with today and have volunteered to help out with this session. So thanks to everyone and welcome. We have our center mission to share with everyone. And before I do that, I had mentioned you could raise your hand, and I saw someone do it, but then it went away. So maybe we'll come back and see when we get to the question and answer moment. But our center's mission is here on your screen, and so I want to highlight that for you before I start my talk. We're very excited to start offering webinars such as this, as well as in-person events on campus, looking at a long-term plan where we are offering events in the community and schools as well to support educators and families. And our mission is focused on children with disabilities, children who are gifted or choice exceptional, as well as students with other unmet needs who might not have been categorized or labeled. So we know that there's a great need out there, and we're looking forward to doing our best to help with that. We also have my contact information here if you'd like to learn more about the center. And please stay tuned for an announcement of an opening celebration that we will be holding on campus in February, as well as some additional webinars like this one in March and April. Today's webinar is based on my sabbatical research and my experience as a teacher, as well as the teaching that I'm doing here today. This is one of our normal Tuesdays on campus where I teach my special education course. So this webinar is sort of embedded in the course as well. And before getting into the content, I want to make sure we set our purpose. So I feel really lucky to be able to achieve a lot of purposes at once. I'm teaching a couple of my classes, and I have some guests here today. We're offering free professional development to teachers and support for families. And this also gives me a chance to actually practice this presentation, which I'll be giving a version of it at a conference in New Orleans in about 8 days. So I appreciate this opportunity. And we're accomplishing a lot at once. The learning goals, the sort of outcomes that I'm hoping to achieve here in the next hour, is to illustrate this interdisciplinary system where we are looking at three big ideas: social emotional learning, culturally responsive practices, and positive behavioral interventions and supports. And a second purpose along with that is to do some outreach beyond Framingham State to those of you who are viewing the webinar live or recorded, to learn what we do here in teacher education programs to prepare future teachers for doing this complex work. So we'll be sharing some case study examples from my research in schools and some examples of quotes from my own students who have been kind enough to share them with me today. On my website, you can take a look at these publications, and I will also share my reference list towards the end of the event. The spring semester, I was away from campus on sabbatical, and I was able to complete a couple of publications on this topic. So the first is a book chapter, which is not out yet, but the second is a journal article, which is open access, and anyone can download that free of cost. So before sharing my content, I also think it's important as teachers and as researchers to frame who we are and share our own identities and positionalities, and understand that, the research that I'm presenting is not free from any subjectivity. It's not neutral or objective. It is shaped by who I am and what I've brought to my work. So I'm going to pause for just a moment and check the online chat here and just see if there's any technical support I need to do. But is everyone able to hear me? So the sound is working? Okay. And once again, you can turn on captions if you're not able to hear the sound, or you can turn on your phone in the upper corner. Okay. So a little bit about me briefly. I came into becoming a teacher, as we all do, with my own set of experiences as a student. And so to reflect on our own upbringing and our schooling, I think is really important. That's something we do with future teachers. So as I begin to study these approaches of culturally responsive practices and looking at social emotional supports for children who have experienced trauma or who are marginalized in their own identities, I need to think about my own positionality in our society. So I think that I come from white privilege and male privilege and experiences of mostly success in school. And so when I have worked with children who don't experience those privileges, whether that's third graders I used to teach or college students I teach today, I think that's an important lens. And so part of this work is trying to keep those conversations active about our own privilege and marginalization and how that shapes our work as teachers and as researchers. My LGBTQ identity is an aspect of my own identity where I've experienced maybe some marginalization as well. So I think I do know what it's like to experience that and to struggle in school with social emotional expectations. And that's driven me to do this type of work towards inclusion and to try to make changes in our schools and in our society. So my goal with my teaching and my research is to help us create a different world and not just replicate the world that exists today. So that drove me to my professional experiences. I worked as a special education teacher and a school psychologist, and I worked primarily with children who have emotional and behavioral needs, labels, diagnoses in different settings. And I worked as a classroom teacher, but also behind the scenes as a psychologist and consultant. And that helped me to see the value in helping teachers and providing them with support. I found that I had a talent with that. So that then brought me into this world of teacher education and preparing future teachers. So my goal with this research and with my teaching is to be proactive and preventative in setting the stage for inclusion for the future. And finally, I think we should always view teaching and research in a socio-political context. So we'll be talking about that today in these theoretical frameworks. And so to know that the research I've been doing, it's been going on in the past 8 years. And we've seen two different presidential administrations. We've seen an election and a big cultural shift, and we're coming up on a primary election soon for the next presidency. So that's been a big conversation in schools, as I think we all know that if we're talking about children and their identities, race, culture, language, as well as their social emotional experiences, we can't disconnect that from the context of what's happening. So that's sort of framing where we're at. The other context is that I am getting over a cold, so I apologize if I start to lose my voice. But here we are, and I think we're ready to move ahead. So that's me. That's who's here. And now I just want to quickly take a glance and see who's here from the chat. And many of you have introduced yourselves. I know we have a lot of Framingham State students here. We also, I believe we have a whole class of Bridgewater State students in teacher education, so welcome to you all. We may have a class of, or a group of teachers at the McAuliffe Charter School, and then many folks who I know from my own teaching, so it's nice to see some friends online. So welcome everybody. And as I'm presenting, please continue to type into the chat box and share your questions. I have a couple of students who are going to keep an eye on that and pull out some questions that we can respond to in a couple minutes. All right, so we're talking about three big ideas: social emotional learning, culturally responsive practices, and positive behavioral interventions and supports. So each of these comes from a different theoretical and philosophical background, and they're each have some similarities and some differences. We also have some barriers that I see to successful implementation for each. So I'd like to just briefly talk about each one and then give some examples. Social emotional learning comes from developmental and psychoeducational theory, and we might see that in schools in the form of individual lessons like circle time or morning meeting. Also, ongoing practices. It's not just about those individual lessons, it's what the teachers are doing all day, every day. And then this third point I think is so important. We can see social emotional learning as embedded in academic instruction. And that's something that's not talked about enough. I see that there's a dialogue out there in the research or in the media sometimes about we should do more social emotional learning and make time for that and not do as much academics. And I don't think that's a helpful dichotomy to make the argument, so I see them as embedded. There's also some barriers that I notice to successful SEL implementation, and one is that it can lack cultural responsiveness. So that's what brings me to want to look at these ideas as combined. The Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has some guidance documents out that discusses this, frankly, and how we can have really good intentions around promoting kindness or social awareness, but if we're not doing that with diversity in mind, then we might just be reinforcing the dominant culture, and that's not what we want. That can be counterproductive towards marginalized students. You might also hear the critique that social emotional learning is fuzzy or soft or not even the teacher's job, and I don't agree with that, but it's out there, so I think we have to do the work to keep helping people understand why it is an important part of our job. And finally, my critique, honestly, is that there's some costly programs out there that require teachers to be trained and spend thousands of dollars, or the school district spends thousands of dollars, and that's just a barrier for districts that don't automatically have that funding. So the next big idea, oh, excuse me, before moving on, I have a couple of quotes from students who have been out in the schools and observing in their field placement classrooms. So this student noticed that her SP, supervising practitioner, has sort of a cool down corner and shared a reflection about how that helps with social emotional support. And this one is about a student who was a child who was crying at this first grade classroom, and how the SP reassured the child it's okay to make mistakes. So that's an important thing that our student was able to see being modeled in the field. The next big idea, culturally responsive practices, comes from a different theoretical perspective, from sociocultural theory and social justice education. And some of the features that we can think about here are that socio-political engagement. So talking about the context of politics in our world, and how do we do that even with young children? The holidays are kind of here with Halloween and Thanksgiving, and there's a lot of conversations that we're having with future teachers about how to approach holidays and diversity and these types of conversations in a way that doesn't shy away from the controversies that we might have out there in the dialogue in schools. So culturally responsive practices asks us to talk to children about that. We had a great conversation in one of my classes about a child who was talking about Santa Claus and how do you handle that? How does the teacher handle that? Also, we want to share authority and control with children. So if you're a teacher whose view is that you should be the authority and your job is to just make children obedient and learn how to follow instructions, maybe that's lacking in some cultural responsiveness. And is that really the goal of education? Or do we want to promote critical thinking and that socio-political engagement of our children to be able to speak out when there's an injustice? So if a rule is unfair at school, don't we want children to be able to feel confident in naming that to the adults? Culturally responsive practices also asks us to bring in cultural references to our teaching. So a math lesson that we can connect to the topics that are of interest to the children, as well as that they have demonstrated strengths with. And finally, high expectations with support. There's a trend that we talk a lot about in education, whether it's special education or thinking about other diverse populations, that there's a tendency to lower expectations to children, if it's students of color or students who are emergent bilingual English language learners, students with disabilities. There can be this tendency to lower expectations and make things easier for those students. But what we want instead is to have high expectations for all students and give them the supports they need to get there. So different supports for different students. Excuse me. The barriers I see to successful implementation of culturally responsive practices, well, one is that it's so flexible. It would look very different in different schools. So that makes it hard to define and hard to train teachers in how to do that. I think we're still seeing teachers shying away from the socio-political conversations, and it's hard to shed that deficit thinking, that lens. Okay. Next, I have one quote from a student's reflection who was able to see in a classroom how the students were given the chance to at times leave a group and calm down and using different strategies, and the student was able to decide when to come back. And that, to me, that's a great example of shared authority. It's not just a teacher saying you need to leave and now you need to come back, but working with a child to learn how to regulate and how to make decisions about their own social emotional well-being. And then a critique, which I always want future teachers to look at what they're seeing in schools and have permission to critique what they see and have a critical eye. And so this student pointed out that they didn't like seeing the teacher use a threat of taking away a privilege. So we can look at that in the context of positive behavior supports. So PBIS asks us to think about that example of threatening to take away a privilege. Maybe there's a way to reverse that, and the teacher can have the children be earning some Friday fun time over the course of the week. And it's a sort of a simple change. This comes from yet another different perspective rooted in behavioral theory. This is probably the approach that I know the most. This is my first classroom, this picture here. Excuse me. And schools often will have core values like respect, cooperate, and share, and build their positive behavioral expectations around that. The use of data is also an important part of PBIS that we don't see as much in the other two approaches. So I think that's a contribution that comes from PBIS. So barriers that I would see with PBIS by itself, it can definitely be lacking in cultural responsiveness. If it's just being used to sort of reinforce the dominant culture, that's not what we want to do in an inclusive school environment. And then it can be critiqued from two different ways. One, that it's too controlling. If these behavioral strategies are used to just get kids to sit down and be quiet and do their work, behavioral strategies are really effective, and if that's what you want to do with them, it actually works pretty well. But maybe that's not the goal that we want to achieve. And on the other side, it can be critiqued as being too permissive, because we're asking teachers not to use those punitive strategies as much, like sending students out of class or using suspension. We're asking them to use more positive strategies. And that can be a challenging shift for teachers who are used to that approach. So another student here at Framingham State observed the teacher using different rug spots and noise-canceling headphones and different strategies to help set children up for successful behaviors. So I thought that was a great example. And those of you who are here on the webinar and you're practicing teachers, you might, rug spots might seem really basic, but if you think about it, we do think about that every day. I know I did as a teacher. It's something really simple, but it's something you're thinking about every day. Where the children will sit and what type of transition you'll do, and that really helps us prepare for learning. All right, so I've taken this time to introduce these three big theories. So thank you for bearing with me. And on this slide, you're seeing each one in a Venn diagram and sort of how I view them as coming together. And the research that's out there, which I will share in my reference list, there are researchers who are looking at combinations of these ideas. So SEL and PBIS have been examined as fitting together nicely. Culturally responsive social emotional learning has been studied and continues to be examined. And then there's folks who are looking at how to do PBIS in a culturally responsive way. So what I'm proposing is, even though it looks a little complicated, is that we can look at all of these big ideas together. So let's stop here to see what's been happening in the online chat. I've been trying to follow along, but it's a little hard as I'm talking. And so I actually have a couple of students who volunteered to pull out some questions, and where are they? Oh, and maybe even read a couple of them aloud, a comment or a question. So I'm looking back there. Are you ready? Okay.
Okay, so we've had a few different people comment on the calming corner, or the calm down corner. And so a common question I saw is that the person noted, I've seen the student be sent to the calm down corner, but he also sort of leaves and returns to his seat at his leisure. Is that typically how this works?
Great. Thank you, Danielle. That's a great question. And I've seen that being used in many different ways. I certainly had a calm down corner, and when I started, though, as a beginning teacher, I didn't. I had a really old school timeout chair, to be honest. It's not what I would do now, but that's how I was taught. So there's more of a timeout chair where I would send students to go. And in my experience, it was a good way for them to calm down, so that's what sort of reinforced me for using it. But through talking with therapists and other sort of related professionals like psychologists who would work with me in the classroom, they helped me realize it's actually better if we can teach the children how to know when it's a good time for them to go to that calm down, kind of cool down corner proactively before there's a problem. And then ideally how to regulate and know when they're ready to come back and be ready to learn. So that worked very well to me once I made that shift. In fact, one of my students, a second grader, I think, at the time, he took a jigsaw puzzle with him when I had asked him to go to a timeout. And he took it with him. he started doing the jigsaw puzzle, and my first thought was, well, you're not allowed to do that. This is a punishment. You should be in timeout. But I quickly realized this is what he needs to help him, and the puzzle was such a perfect timeout activity, or now we would call it a cool down corner activity, that we wound up leaving the jigsaw puzzle there as a tool for everyone. So that's something that worked for me. Do you want to share another from that you've seen?
I think that was the biggest question. It's a lot of commenting
Okay,
back
so
and
we'll
forth.
move ahead. Thank you for that. And I'll just say, because I see Allison, hi Allison, on there, saying explicit expectations or instructions around how a cool down corner is used. So yes, it might be sort of a learning process for the teachers and the children together, but it's helpful to then make it clear like how we're going to use this tool. And that's really building a culture, isn't it? That's building your classroom culture. And how do we do that in a culturally responsive way? So next, I'd like to share some examples from my research. In the spring, I was able to interview some teachers and visit some schools and learn a little bit about what teachers are doing from pre-K through high school, including general education and special education. So my forthcoming book chapter is going to share these case examples. So Sarah and Andrea from the McAuliffe Charter School here in Framingham shared with me some posters that they made at the start of the year. This is a 6th grade co-taught classroom, and this approach is very culturally responsive as you're building the classroom culture, and also includes a social emotional component, and we're thinking about positive behaviors that we want to see. So I thought this was a great example of an activity that many teachers do at the start of each school year, asking students to contribute their ideas to how we want our classroom to be. So in this example, that school has school-wide PBIS in place. Not every school has sort of a formal system, but if you do, then you can sort of build your activities around those core values, like collaboration, perseverance, responsibility, inquiry, kindness. And then a social emotional curriculum is the tribe's curriculum, a research-based curriculum that they used, and this activity is called the graffiti activity. And right from the beginning, asking students to open up and share their feelings, which I think sets a really nice culture from the start. And then finally, the debriefing of this activity that's a really important part of these types of social emotional activities. Is we do the activity and then we talk about how it went and what we felt and what the process was like. So that's a really important type of conversation that I think teachers need to learn how to facilitate. It's different from facilitating a math talk. It's a little bit more messy, and you have to really listen and draw people out. But it sounds like in this classroom they highlighted where we agree and where we have sort of shared visions for what the classroom might look like, but also differences and diverse perspectives, and not to gloss over that, but to point out that we might have different ideas, and that's important too. So to me, that's a great connection to culturally responsive practices. I also visited a preschool classroom here in Framingham at the Blocks Preschool, and we actually have in person here Elvira, the teacher, who is maybe going to pass around to my students who are here today one of the photo books that she's made. And in her classroom, I was able to hear her talk a little bit about a song that she uses called "I Am Different," emphasizing how difference is good, to keep it simple. And of course, one of my favorite books as well that I read to my daughter, "It's Okay to Be Different" by Todd Parr. And in our interview, we talked a little bit about her reflective practices. And I thought this was a great example that I want future teachers to be thinking about, as I tried to do at the beginning of my talk, to share my own background and my experiences and how that shapes my work. And Elvira shared about her own background and experiences as well. and now working with students who also have immigrated here to the United States and are learning English. She brings that perspective to her work with children and families. The connection to social emotional learning was very evident with some of her lessons, like one that others may have used or seen, where there's a heart that we pass around and crumple it, and for young children to learn that words can be hurtful, and to have a physical, visual representation of that, and then you can't really unwrinkle that. So to think about how we want to be kind with our words. And that ties in nicely to the school's positive behavior support system. This is another school that does have a school-wide set of values and strategies. So that was a really great interview that allowed me to see these three themes in practice again. One of my other interviews is sort of connected to the other publication, the case study journal article that you can read that's freely available. And this is in an elementary school that uses a social emotional screening tool. And they do universal screening of every child. Every teacher rates every child in the school to rate their social emotional needs. And in this case study, we were able to look at how the teachers use that information to choose students who might benefit from a targeted, additional, supplemental kind of intervention beyond the basics of what every child is getting. And so I realize this is a little small to see, but you're seeing a sample classroom of children and their risk level for needing additional supports. And so that research comes out of social emotional learning and is definitely connected to PBIS. But where we saw in this school, the teachers taking a very culturally responsive approach to using that data. There was a very rich conversation, not just looking at the numbers, teachers sort of reminding one another and themselves that we're not reducing each child to a number, but we're taking that research-based tool and we're seeing those risk levels that are based on research, but then we're looking at the qualitative knowledge of each child and bringing culture into the equation. And so these are a couple of quotes from my college students who were able to come with me a couple of years ago to the school and observe that meeting. And they could see that the teachers knew each child and were discussing each child's needs individually, while at the same time being efficient with that screening tool and being able to quickly select a group of students to then receive a targeted intervention. So I thought that was a great example of all three themes as well. Next is a school where I was a teacher, where you saw my posters from my first classroom, the Wadiko School in New Hampshire. And many years ago, I actually had the privilege to teach a woodworking summer class, if you can believe that. But there's a teacher now who is a real woodworker, a talented vocational teacher. And I was able to interview him about his work with middle and high school students in New Hampshire at this special education therapeutic school program. And you're seeing here a poster with some behavioral expectations. And this is a school that uses a lot of positive behavioral strategies with the students who are there primarily because of a label of emotional and behavioral disability. So every child has very individualized behavioral plans. And the teacher was able to reflect on the differences in seeing students in this hands-on woodworking classroom, and then also seeing them in the core English, language arts, and math classrooms throughout the day. From a social emotional perspective, he noticed that the students were really showing confidence, and sometimes for the first time feeling proud of their work or having a success in school, or taking on a leadership role with peers. Excuse me. And thinking about the cultural backgrounds of the students is very interesting in this context, because there are many students from rural New Hampshire, from families with that woodworking sort of knowledge built into their cultural and familial upbringing. So that was a strength they already possessed, and to be able to do that at school was building on their strengths. But at the same time, many students who were new to woodworking, students from urban communities who had come to the school, and they also took to it quickly and were able to learn because of the hands-on learning aspect of that. And finally, I just added in another theme because I do think we should keep academic content instruction in mind always when we're talking about these school practices, and any of these lessons that are social emotional in nature can always have an academic connection. So the woodworking classroom was a great way for this teacher to build in mathematics learning objectives that he was trying to also accomplish in this traditional math part of the day, but to embed them into this hands-on activity, as well as a chance to work on oral language communications. So that was a really great example. And then I had the chance to interview teachers in a kindergarten classroom, a general and special education teacher, and we really focused in on one child to think about a case example, and with the permission of this child's family, just anonymizing the school and the name, so we'll call him Tobias, but a 6-year-old boy with Down syndrome whose family speaks English and Turkish at home and was completing his 2nd year in kindergarten. And these teachers, excuse me, these teachers shared a lot of their practices with me that I also found to connect with the 3 themes. So a lot of that shared authority that we mentioned earlier, the school sounds like they went above and beyond, and at least these 2 teachers really took some time to meet with the family, and the family, listen to the family and give them a chance to share their vision, but also to make really specific recommendations, which we don't always see in the IEP process. The families don't always feel that they're given that true seat at the table. So I thought this was a great example of what that can look like, and drilling down to just really specific examples. The family was given a chance to recommend which times of the day the child would be pulled out of the classroom, so as not to miss certain activities. But backing up before that, just having the child be placed in an inclusion classroom rather than a substantially separate classroom, which is not always the case for a child with Down syndrome. So it sounds like there was a lot of cultural responsiveness there. And then this is a classroom where the responsive classroom approach is used, a research-based social emotional curriculum. And there's a greeting that children often will do in their morning meeting. And so the teacher incorporated the Turkish language greeting to bring in that child's, one of the child's home languages as well. And then, as we've talked about in my courses, if you have a student with an intellectual impairment such as Down syndrome in a class of young children, there can be some challenges around building the culture of the students. So, so these teachers reflected on their thoughtful approach to modeling for the rest of the class how to have wait time for that student. So letting that student have some thinking time before responding to a prompt. And as the children are seeing the teachers do that, then the children start to do that as well in their interactions with the child. But at the same time, wanting to promote a normalized interactions and avoid the problem of the child becoming a mascot, which we see sometimes in a classroom culture. And we want to avoid that as well. So it sounds like that worked well in this case, and the family reported that this child is sort of having play dates with the rest of the class and birthday parties and that sort of thing. So we can see a real nice example of social inclusion, true social inclusion. Excuse me. So I've saved some time. This is good because those were my quick examples. I hope that when this chapter comes out, I can share that with you to read more in depth about those examples. But thinking about these big ideas, I would love to come back to the online chat in a moment. So I'm looking back at Danielle and Chrissy. Are there some questions or comments or examples that anyone has shared? Okay, so I'm going to mute myself.
So one of the questions we had was about social emotional learning and metacognition. And they said it's interesting to think about the methods for us as adult educators and counselors, but we also want to help children with their own metacognition. So they were asking you if you had something on child metacognition as part of social emotional learning.
Okay, I like that. I like metacognition as another lens to bring into this conversation. So much of the research in social emotional learning, even though I don't always frame it as such, it comes from neuropsychology, and there's a lot of thinking about cognitive science. So I don't know. I guess that I usually talk about metacognition in different terms just to kind of keep it in more everyday language, like reflections and reflective practice. To me, metacognition means sort of thinking about thinking, and that's really good for us to do as teachers and future teachers. But to have children do that, it's not that hard. I mean, we just have to frame it for them as, how do you know that? So as we're building that into academic instruction, math lesson, for example, asking children to justify their thinking, to show their thinking, and give evidence, or from English language arts, giving evidence from a text. And that's academic, but it's also social emotional. So I don't know if that's what they were getting at. I hope so. Anything else you want to highlight from there?
Comment that was made, and I just wanted to restate it for anyone that didn't see it in the chat. Someone commented, in my first grade classroom, we started the year learning about tools, physical tools that you use with your hands, but also tools you use with your brain, responsibility, collaboration, perseverance, and initiative. Now we are combining these physical and mental tools to work in groups to create physical items needed for the classroom. It's amazing to see how the students are able to identify when their group is using collaboration or not, for example.
I love that. And with young children, it's always wonderful to have something physical that represents an abstract idea just because of their developmental stage. So whoever you are, I'd love an example in the chat of a tool like that, of what's something physical. Because it makes me think about the jigsaw puzzle or stress balls that I've used. But yeah. Wow. Okay. Thank you. So I'm seeing Nancy. Hi, Nancy. I know you. Your hand is up. Would you like to be able to say something? I'm going to try to give you microphone access right now, so that you can turn on your microphone if you want to, Nancy, now, and share a comment if you'd like. We'll see if that works. So thank you. I'm looking through these comments as well. There's some great links as well being shared in the chat, just resources, things that you can look up later.
Hi, James. It is Nancy, and I did figure out how to turn the microphone.
To that with Nancy, if she has something to say. I don't hear her. Does anyone hear her?
Can you hear me now? I'm wondering if people can hear me.
Oh, I hear you now. I'm sorry. I didn't have my sound on. Go ahead, Nancy.
So partly I was hoping to figure out how this worked, James, so true confessions. But I did want to comment about the metacognition for young children. And I think of it, if you imagine Winnie the Pooh, when many of us know Winnie, and like he taps on his head and he says, think, think, think. I had a little image of that in my counseling room or whatever, and we would think about, when we were talking about kids' feelings or why they behaved a certain way, and we could always use that as sort of a visual reminder, like, now think, why did, how do we think? Are we going to think before we do something? Are we going to think about why we did something and try to figure out what other choices are? I just think that that Winnie the Pooh thinking was a good metacognition cue, because of course you don't say metacognition to your elementary school first graders or whatever, but it was very helpful to get them to stop and pause. It was helpful behaviorally and also for themselves to calm themselves, to stop up escalation.
Nice. So that's great, and that has a cultural reference of Winnie the Pooh that many children might be aware of, and then if what we might do to make that even more culturally responsive is to think about other cultural references too beyond Winnie that other children might be aware of that they could also achieve that goal. So I love that. Thank you, Nancy. I'm going to have you come back on at the end, okay, to help me with an announcement. Okay, so is there anyone else with their hand raised that I didn't see? Okay, and then what I thought I would try, I don't know if this will work, but if there's any comments or questions in the room and you would like to share that, you can turn on your laptop microphone and share if you haven't already shared. I just want to give everyone every opportunity. Okay, I think everyone's already chatted what they want to chat. Is there anything else? One more, go right ahead.
Someone else in the chat was asking if you could discuss more about the rug spots and how that can be applied in the classroom.
About the what?
Rug spots. So I think you were talking about having different students assigned.
Sure, rug spots. I think that's a great conversation to have as teachers, with your team, your colleagues about, and the basic conversation that I hear most often is, are we going to assign students places to sit, or are we going to let them choose their own seats, or some combination of that? And the many students I've had here at Framingham State that they're kind of out in classrooms all over the region, and it just seems like a mix of practices, and teachers kind of take one of those two approaches. I see the value of either one. At the beginning of the school year, often, you might see teachers sort of assigning the seats, and then when they feel the children are ready, letting them start to choose their own seats. But I've also seen the reverse, where they start with letting the students choose, and then at some point they might say, oh, this isn't working now, I'm going to assign seats. So, I don't think there's like a research-based answer to one or the other, but it's a really good reflective question to have overall. I am going to start to wrap things up with 5 big ideas to keep in mind as you go forward. And then we will end with some announcements. So as I looked at these 3 big areas of research and practice and how they come together, I came out with 5 key understandings. One is, as I've said a few times, I think as educators, we bring our own selves and our backgrounds to work, and we can't separate that out. So on the left is an example that you might see in schools, that teachers are trying to diversify their curriculum, particularly white teachers or heterosexual or non-disabled teachers who know that they're working with students from different identities. I think there's a lot of teachers who are trying to be a good ally, for lack of a better term, a good advocate or ally to other groups by diversifying their curriculum. So we're seeing more of that, I think, which is good. And so as we prepare future teachers, we're having them read about that and think about their own privilege and identity, and just reflecting on these topics about race and disability. And I definitely recommend the implicit associations test if you haven't checked that out. And then just looking at research, it's not just, again, it's not just soft or fuzzy discussions about diversity. There's a lot of research that shows how we need more representations in the curriculum and in our instruction. Another big idea to keep in mind is all behaviors are shaped and viewed in cultural context. So something we're seeing in schools is the use of office discipline data systems or other data systems, like looking at special education data and looking at disproportionality, racial or based on disability, and then trying to change that trend through structured protocols. Schools are doing a lot of great work in that area. With future teachers, we often look a little bit smaller at like an individual case study and think about a student's behavior. So eye contact is one that I often use, and think about that as, we see a lot of teachers trying to get children to give eye contact, right? As a way to show that you're paying attention. But that might be different, valued differently in different cultures, and it might be different based on the child's disability, such as autism. So we can kind of look at the complexity of that. A reminder that sort of comes from culturally responsive practices is about the history of the U.S. school system. I think we have to remember that it has been a struggle for many underrepresented groups, whether that's race or disability or language. And so if you're a teacher, a white teacher, for example, and you're working with a lot of diverse students and families, then to think about the social emotional content of that history and the students' parents and maybe grandparents and their history in the school system. And there's generations of experiences to keep in mind. And so rather than saying I'm the authority and the family should do what I'm recommending, think about how you can earn the trust of families. So to accomplish that with future teachers, we bring in guest speakers to share, families, parents, and guardians to share their experiences in the school system. And we try to read diverse authors as well who bring those lived experiences to their scholarship. I'm just borrowing this from the title of a book that I recommend that's in my reference list. It's called All Learning is Social and Emotional. And I think I've delivered that point over the last hour. But as an example, in math instruction, I think that's a great way to build in social emotional learning. It's not separate. It's a part of one of the standards for mathematical practice there at the bottom. And if we're having students work in groups, let's be intentional about their social emotional functioning. So our students here that are taking the mathematics methods course are asked to do that in one of the first lesson plans that they write. They have to incorporate social emotional learning with math instruction. And as the quotes show that I shared with you, students are always reflecting on what they throughout each day in field placements through that lens. And finally, I think it's important to understand the principles of behavioral psychology, whether or not you're intentionally choosing to take a behaviorist approach to your work with children, which I'm not recommending. I think that's why we want to think about this multifaceted approach. But my example here on the left is about an experience I had where we can look at a child's behavior patterns and notice a trend in which the unwanted behavior is being reinforced by a student being able to leave the classroom and avoid a task they don't want to do. So if you're not thinking through a behavioral lens, at times you might not realize that you're reinforcing a certain behavior in a certain way. So I think that's really valuable to know if you haven't studied PBIS. So having future teachers learn about that perspective, but also critique it as we've done today and understand that behavioral strategies are going to be most inclusive and effective if we're looking at cultural responsiveness and social emotional dimensions as well. Okay, so as I've been doing this research and thinking about it, I am looking ahead to a couple of ideas for the future for my research or what I'd like to see come out of this work. I think PBIS offers a really powerful approach to school change. And if we can do that without focusing just on obedience and compliance and reproducing the dominant cultural norms, we can harness it in a more effective way towards social justice, towards culturally responsive teaching. And then finally, the idea of merging these practices with academic instruction. So that's something that I'd like to see more of and do more myself is examining the curriculum frameworks and the prescribed curriculums that our teachers are required to use in some districts, and looking at those adaptations that can be made. So that is bringing me to our last couple of minutes. I would like to just thank everyone one more time for being here in person and online in the webinar. You will be able to watch this archived video later on my website at jamescressy.com. There's also a list of citations from this presentation and my publications, and some other just links to websites on these topics if you'd like to learn more. And you'll see the past webinars that I've facilitated and some future webinars that we're excited to announce in this series with the Chris Walsh Center. So we just today were able to confirm a couple of these dates. So you will see soon on my website the opportunity to sign up for these next two webinars. And I'm looking to see if Nancy is still there and wants to say something about this first webinar on the topic of dyslexia. So
I am here if you can hear me.
go ahead.
So Dr. Nadine Dove, for those who have not heard of her, is a cognitive neuroscience researcher at Boston Children's, and her specialty is early cognitive indicators through using fMRI and other technology, brain imaging technology, to look at learning differences, particularly dyslexia, but also she also studies music and some other impacts on the brain. And she was one of the initial researchers that discovered kids with reading disability could be predicted as early as age 4 and 5, and in infant sleeping, she actually gets infants to sleep in an fMRI. So that's alone is a clever talent. But anyway, she is going to talk about screening and what the research says, and it's fairly exciting.
So thank you for that, Nancy. And then in April we will have a presentation from Dr. Mary Grace Stewart, who is from the Massachusetts Association for Gifted Education, and she'll share some strategies that, again, for teachers and families, educators, as well as parents, guardians, to think about the needs of twice exceptional learners. So that's children who have a documented disability, as well as having documented gifted or advanced skills. So we're looking forward to that. For now, it's all on jamescressy.com/webinars, but you can look for the Chris Walsh Center website to be coming out soon on the Framingham State website, as well as an announcement about our center opening celebration. But for now, if you go to my website, you can see that, as well as taking a survey about this webinar. Please do that and share your feedback on this webinar, suggestions, feedback, and topics that you'd like to see us address in the future. With that, it is just about 4 o'clock, so I think we will wrap it up and say thank you again to everyone. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.